Josef Mengele drowned on a Brazilian beach on February 7, 1979, but the world would not learn of his death for another 6 years. For 3 decades, the most wanted Nazi war criminal had lived as a ghost, hidden not by a shadowy network of former SS officers, but by something far more ordinary and far more effective: his own family. The Mengeles were not minor collaborators scrambling to distance themselves from a disgraced relative. They were one of the wealthiest industrial families in Bavaria, and they used every resource at their disposal to ensure that the angel of death would never face justice. His widow remarried and built a new life. His son grew up not knowing his father's true identity. His brothers funneled money across continents through trusted intermediaries. And when Mengele finally died, alone in the surf off São Paulo, his family kept silent for 6 more years while intelligence agencies chased a dead man across South America. What happened to the Mengele family? After World War II is not a story of justice delayed. It is a story of justice denied entirely, a case study in how wealth, loyalty, and legal loopholes can shield even the most monstrous of men from accountability. To understand how the Mengele family protected Josef for so long, one must first understand who they were before he became infamous. The Mengeles were not aristocrats or old money. They were industrialists, self-made and pragmatic, rooted in the Bavarian town of Günzburg. Karl Mengele Sr. founded the family business in 1907, establishing a small workshop that manufactured agricultural equipment. The timing proved fortuitous. As Germany industrialized its farming sector in the early 20th century, demand for mechanized equipment surged. Karl Mengele expanded aggressively, and by the 1930s, Mengele Agrartechnik had become one of the leading manufacturers of threshers, balers, and combines in southern Germany. The company employed hundreds of workers in Günzburg, making the Mengele name synonymous with prosperity in the region. If you were a German farmer in the 1950s or 1960s, there was a good chance you owned equipment with the name Mengele stamped on it. Josef was born on March 16, 1911, the eldest of 3 sons. His brothers, Karl Jr. and Alois, would later play crucial roles in protecting him during his years as a fugitive. The family was Catholic, conservative, and ambitious. Karl Sr. expected his sons to contribute to the business, but Josef had other aspirations. He excelled academically and pursued degrees in medicine and anthropology, eventually earning doctorates from both Munich and Frankfurt universities. His academic work focused on genetics and heredity, fields that aligned disturbingly well with Nazi racial ideology. When war came, Josef volunteered for the Waffen-SS Medical Corps. His path to Auschwitz was not accidental. It was the culmination of years of ideological commitment and scientific ambition. Josef married Irene Schönbein in 1939. She was the daughter of a professor, educated and refined, and she gave birth to their only child, Rolf, in 1944. By then, Josef had already been stationed at Auschwitz for over a year. Irene knew her husband worked at a concentration camp, but the full nature of his activities remained obscured by wartime secrecy and her own willingness not to ask too many questions. The marriage would not survive the war intact, though its dissolution would prove to be more strategic than emotional. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, Josef Mengele was not in Auschwitz. He had fled the camp in January as Soviet forces approached, taking with him crates of research materials documenting his experiments on twins, dwarfs, and others he had subjected to medical torture. He made his way westward, eventually surrendering to American forces near Nuremberg. Here, the first of many failures of post-war justice occurred. Mengele was processed as a prisoner of war, but not identified as a war criminal. The chaos of the immediate post-war period, combined with incomplete records and the sheer number of prisoners being processed, allowed him to slip through. He was released in August 1945 and spent the next 4 years living under his real name in Germany, working as a farmhand in the Bavarian countryside while the Nuremberg trials proceeded without him. The Mengele family's protection network began operating almost immediately. While Josef hid in plain sight, his father and brothers managed the family business and monitored the evolving landscape of war crimes investigations. They understood that their brother's anonymity was temporary. As survivor testimonies accumulated and Allied investigators began piecing together the horrors of Auschwitz, the name Mengele appeared with increasing frequency. Witnesses described a doctor who stood on the platform as trains arrived, pointing left or right, sending some prisoners to the gas chambers and selecting others for labor or medical experiments. They spoke of a man who whistled classical music while making his selections, who seemed genuinely enthusiastic about his work, who had personally overseen experiments that caused unimaginable suffering. By 1949, it was clear that Josef could no longer remain in Germany. The escape route Josef used was well established by the time he needed it. Known as the Rat Line, it was a network of safe houses, sympathetic officials, and forged documents that stretched from Germany through Austria and Italy to South America. The Catholic Church played a role, though the extent of institutional knowledge versus individual complicity remains debated by historians. Josef travelled through Austria to Italy, where he obtained a passport under the name Helmut Gregor. On July 25, 1949, he boarded a ship in Genoa bound for Buenos Aires. Argentina under Juan Perón was openly welcoming to former Nazis, offering a combination of political sympathy and bureaucratic indifference that made it an ideal destination for war criminals seeking to disappear. But disappearing required money, and money required family. This is where the Mengele network proved most effective. Unlike other Nazi fugitives who scraped by on savings or relied on ideologically motivated support organizations, Josef had access to the resources of a thriving industrial enterprise. Every month, without fail, a stipend of between $100 and $175 made its way from Günzburg to wherever Josef was hiding. The amounts sound modest by contemporary standards, but in 1950s Argentina, this was enough to live comfortably. Not lavishly, Josef complained constantly about money throughout his years in exile, but safely. The payments would continue for over 30 years. The man who made the financial network function was Hans Sedlmayr. He was not a family member, but something equally valuable. A loyal employee of Mengele Agrartechnik, who had worked for the company for decades. Sedlmayr served as the single thread connecting Josef to his relatives' wealth. He handled the transfers, carried letters back and forth, and ensured that the world's most wanted Nazi doctor never ran out of money or lost contact with home. Every transaction was carefully managed to avoid detection. There were no direct wire transfers from Germany to Josef. There was no paper trail that investigators could easily follow. The family understood they were committing crimes by aiding a fugitive, but they also understood that getting caught required making mistakes, so they made none. In 1954, Josef's marriage to Irene officially ended in divorce. On paper, this looked like rejection, a woman severing ties with a monster she could no longer stand beside. The reality was more calculated. Irene's divorce was not about abandoning Josef, it was about protecting the family's cover story. With the divorce finalized, Irene could remarry without raising questions. She could move on publicly, present, herself as a woman who had put her past behind her. Meanwhile, Josef remained very much in contact with the family through Sedlmayr's courier network. The divorce was theatre, a way to make his trail go cold, but the story takes a stranger turn. In 1958, Josef's brother Carl Jr. died, leaving behind a widow named Martha. She was family by marriage, connected to the Mengeles through tragedy. That same year, Martha traveled to South America to marry Josef. The arrangement sounds almost medieval, like something from a dynastic alliance rather than a 20th century family. But it served a purpose. It gave Josef a companion, someone to share his isolation, someone bound to him by family ties that predated his crimes. Martha and Josef lived together in Argentina for years, a grotesque parody of domestic normalcy. She eventually returned to Europe, but the marriage demonstrated something important about the Mengele family's approach to protecting their fugitive relative. They were willing to sacrifice personal happiness for the sake of family loyalty. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Josef lived relatively openly in Argentina. He practiced medicine, socialized with other German expatriates, and even visited Buenos Aires nightclubs. The West German government had issued a warrant for his arrest in 1959, but enforcement was practically non-existent. Argentina had no extradition treaty with Germany for war crimes, and local authorities showed little interest in pursuing former Nazis. Josef felt secure enough to use variations of his real name and to apply for Argentine citizenship under the name Josef Mengele. The application was approved. Everything changed in 1960. That May, Israeli Mossad agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires, drugging him and smuggling him to Israel to stand trial for his role in organizing the Holocaust. The Eichmann operation sent shockwaves through the community of Nazi exiles in South America. If Eichmann could be taken, anyone could be taken. Josef panicked. Within weeks of Eichmann's capture, he fled Argentina for Paraguay, then later to Brazil. His days of living openly were over. For the remaining 19 years of his life, he would exist as a hunted man, moving between safe houses, using false names, and depending entirely on the money and logistics his family provided from Germany. The family's role in this later period became even more critical. As Josef moved from country to country, Sedlmayr remained his lifeline. Letters traveled through a carefully constructed chain of intermediaries. Money arrived through channels designed to be untraceable. The family never wavered, even as the manhunt intensified and the risks of exposure grew. They had made a choice in 1949, and they stuck with it for 3 decades. In 1956, a 12-year-old German boy went on a ski vacation in Switzerland. He spent 2 weeks with a quiet, distant stranger his family introduced as Uncle Fritz. The man was cold, formal, and seemed uncomfortable around children. The boy would not learn for another 4 years that this stranger was his father. Rolf Mengele's childhood was defined by absence and deception. His mother, Irene, had remarried after divorcing Josef, and Rolf grew up using his stepfather's surname. He knew almost nothing about his biological father beyond vague references to a relative who lived abroad. The ski trip to Switzerland was carefully orchestrated by the family, a rare opportunity for Josef to see his son without revealing his identity. Rolf returned home with a strange feeling he could not name. 4 years later, at 16, he would finally understand why. His mother sat him down and told him the truth. Uncle Fritz was Josef Mengele. His father, the man who had conducted experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, the man every Allied intelligence agency was hunting, the man whose name had become synonymous with the worst crimes of the Nazi regime. And his family had known where he was the entire time. The revelation transformed Rolf's understanding of his own life. Every Christmas card from abroad, every coded message passed through family channels, every awkward silence when relatives discussed the past, all of it suddenly made sense. He was the son of a monster, and his entire family had conspired to keep that monster safe. Rolf later described experiencing profound moral conflict. He had been raised in post-war Germany, educated about the Holocaust, taught to condemn the crimes of the Nazi regime, and yet his own flesh and blood was among the worst perpetrators, and his family expected him to maintain the code of silence. For years, Rolf complied. He did not reveal what he knew. He did not contact authorities. He maintained the family's protective fiction. But the questions gnawed at him. What had his father actually done? Did he feel any remorse? Was there any humanity left in the man who had caused so much suffering? In 1977, Rolf made a decision. He would go to Brazil and confront his father face to face. He would ask the questions that had haunted him since he was 16. He would look into the eyes of Josef Mengele and try to understand. What he found would stay with him for the rest of his life. Rolf arrived in Brazil to find a 67-year-old man living under the name Wolfgang Gerhardt. The alias belonged to an Austrian Nazi sympathizer who had befriended Josef years earlier, a man who eventually died and left Mengele his identity to use. Josef was bitter by then, isolated. He complained constantly about money, about his health, about the restrictions of his hidden life. He had aged poorly, his face weathered by decades of paranoia and tropical heat. But what struck Rolf most was not his father's physical deterioration. It was his complete lack of remorse. Josef Mengele claimed he had never personally harmed anyone. He insisted he was just doing his duty. He expressed no guilt for the experiments, the selections, the children who died under his watch. In his own mind, he was a scientist who had been given an opportunity and taken it. The moral dimension simply did not register. Rolf pushed back. He challenged his father's rationalizations. He demanded some acknowledgement of the horror, but Josef would not give it because he genuinely did not feel it. The man who had caused so much suffering felt nothing about it. The conversation between father and son lasted several days. Rolf pressed Josef on specific incidents that had been documented by survivors. He asked about the twins, about the experiments, about the selections on the platform. Josef deflected, minimized, rationalized. He portrayed himself as a researcher operating within the constraints of wartime, as someone who had made the best of difficult circumstances. He seemed incapable of understanding why anyone would judge him harshly. The disconnect between Josef's self-perception and the reality of his crimes was absolute. Rolf returned to Germany with his answer. His father was exactly what the survivors had described: a man without conscience, a man who could compartmentalize atrocity so completely that it simply ceased to exist in his own memory. But Rolf kept the secret. He did not reveal his father's location. The family's code of silence held. 2 years after Rolf's visit, on February 7, 1979, Josef Mengele went swimming at Bertioga Beach near São Paulo. He was 67 years old, in declining health, and the water was rougher than he expected. Somewhere in the waves, he suffered a stroke. He drowned before anyone could reach him. His body was recovered and buried in Embu das Artes under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. No announcement, no notification to authorities. The family that had protected him for 30 years simply absorbed the news and said nothing. And so the world kept hunting a dead man. For 6 more years, intelligence agencies followed leads, chased rumors, and investigated sightings. Josef Mengele was reported in Paraguay, in Argentina, and in remote corners of South America where fugitives were known to hide. None of it was real. He had been in the ground since 1979. The family watched this manhunt continue and remained silent. They had protected Josef in life. Now they were protecting him in death, or perhaps protecting themselves from the questions that would follow if they admitted what they knew. The silence finally broke in 1985. International pressure had been mounting for years. The 40th anniversary of the end of World War II brought renewed attention to unpunished war criminals. Governments offered increased rewards, investigators intensified their efforts. And then, facing the prospect of more invasive scrutiny, the Mengele family decided to end the charade. They admitted Josef had died 6 years earlier. They provided his diaries, his letters, his dental records. They led investigators to the grave in Embu das Artes. Forensic analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Josef Mengele. Dental records matched. Bone measurements were consistent with his known height and build. In 1992, DNA testing provided final confirmation when samples from the remains were compared to blood from Rolf Mengele. The case was closed. The Angel of Death had been dead for over a decade. What viewers might not expect is what happened next. Nothing. The Mengele family faced 0 legal consequences for their decades of assistance to a fugitive war criminal. West German law included a provision called Angehörigen privilege, a legal protection for close relatives who help a fugitive family member evade capture. The law recognized that asking people to turn in their own blood was too much to demand. It carved out an exception to obstruction of justice when family was involved. Because of this provision, despite funding a war criminal for 34 years, despite routing money through couriers, despite elaborate deceptions designed to throw investigators off the trail, the Mengeles walked free. Not a single family member faced prosecution. The legal immunity extended even to Hans Siedelmeier, who was not a family member but had been protected by other technicalities. German prosecutors investigated him in the 1980s, but concluded that the statute of limitations had expired on most potential charges. The man who had served as Josef Mengele's lifeline for 3 decades faced no punishment. The Mengele company itself survived into the 1990s, though it struggled financially in its later years. In the 1980s, the state of Bavaria provided a multi-million-mark bailout to Mengele Agrartechnik. The company was struggling, and the government stepped in to save jobs. German taxpayers had effectively subsidized the family network that shielded the Angel of Death. When this connection became public, outrage followed, but it changed nothing. The money was already spent. The family remained untouched. The company that bore the Mengele name eventually went bankrupt in the late 1990s. It was acquired, stripped for parts, and sold off piece by piece. The agricultural equipment division was eventually absorbed by Lely in 2010, and then by Aggo in 2017. The farm equipment that once carried the Mengele logo now carries different branding entirely. The name has vanished from tractors and balers across Europe, though it lingers in historical records and survivor testimonies. Rolf Mengele lived out his remaining years under his wife's surname, his own children shielded as much as possible from the weight of their grandfather's crimes. In 1985, after the family admitted Josef's death, Rolf gave a single interview describing his meeting with his father in Brazil. He spoke carefully, measured, clearly still processing what he had learned decades earlier. He described his father as a man who had completely compartmentalized his crimes, who seemed genuinely incapable of understanding why others condemned him. Rolf expressed no sympathy for his father's ideology, but acknowledged the complexity of his own position. He was the son of a monster, raised by a family that had protected that monster, and he had chosen to maintain their silence until circumstances made silence impossible. Then, Rolf retreated from public life and never spoke about it again. He practiced law in Germany, built a career, raised his family, and avoided any further engagement with his father's legacy. He died in 2017 at the age of 72. His obituaries noted his connection to Josef Mengele, but could say little about how he had processed that burden internally. He had shared his story once and then sealed it away. Irene Mengele, Josef's first wife and Rolf's mother, lived until 1995. After divorcing Josef, she had remarried and built a new life in Germany. She rarely spoke publicly about her first husband and successfully distanced herself from his crimes in the eyes of German society. Her divorce, whatever its strategic motivations in 1954, had allowed her to move on in ways that other wives of Nazi war criminals could not. Martha Mengele, Josef's second wife and former sister-in-law, returned to Europe after their years together in South America. She lived quietly in Germany and Austria, avoiding public attention. The marriage had been a peculiar arrangement from the start, driven more by family obligation than romantic attachment, and it had effectively ended when Martha left South America in the early 1970s. She outlived Josef by many years and maintained the family's silence about his whereabouts until the 1985 revelation. The broader Mengele family scattered and faded from public attention after the company's bankruptcy. Carl Jr. had died in 1958, before Josef's years as a hunted fugitive became most intense. Alois, the youngest brother, managed the family business through its difficult later years and faced public criticism when the company's connection to Josef became widely known. But like other family members, he suffered no legal consequences. The Angehörigen privilege protected him as it protected them all. The Mengele case raises profound questions about post-war justice and the limits of accountability. Josef Mengele never faced trial. He never sat before judges while survivors testified about what he had done. He never heard a verdict read aloud in a courtroom. He died free on a beach, age 67, surrounded by the anonymity his family had purchased for him. The survivors who might have confronted him in court were denied that closure. The machinery of family loyalty, money, silence, and legal loopholes proved stronger than any manhunt. Historians and legal scholars continue to debate how the Mengele case should be understood. Some emphasize the failures of post-war intelligence, particularly the early period when Josef lived openly in Germany and even Argentina without detection. Others focus on the inadequacy of international cooperation in pursuing war criminals, noting that Argentina's refusal to extradite and Brazil's lax enforcement created safe havens that no investigation could penetrate. Still others point to the Angehörigen privilege and similar provisions in other countries as fundamental obstacles to accountability, arguing that family loyalty should not override the demands of justice for crimes against humanity. The Mengele family's protection of Josef was not unique in its basic form. Other Nazi families also aided fugitive relatives, provided money, maintained contact, and kept secrets. But the Mengeles were distinctive in their resources and their success. The family's wealth, generated by a thriving industrial enterprise, provided financial security that most fugitives could not match. The company's legitimate business operations created cover for the transfers and communications that kept Josef connected to home. And the family's cohesion, their willingness to maintain the conspiracy across decades and generations, ensured that the secret held until they chose to reveal it. Some Nazi families rejected their war criminal relatives. Some faced consequences for the protection they provided. The Mengeles did neither. They funded Josef for 3 decades, orchestrated elaborate deceptions, and quietly waited for history to forget. In the end, they essentially won. Justice was denied not by escape but by family. The case also illuminates the psychological burden carried by descendants of Nazi perpetrators. Rolf Mengele's journey from childhood ignorance to adolescent revelation to adult confrontation traces an arc that many children of war criminals experienced in some form. The discovery that a parent or grandparent committed atrocities creates a crisis of identity that no simple response can resolve. Some descendants have chosen public condemnation, speaking out against their relatives' crimes and supporting educational initiatives about the Holocaust. Others have retreated into silence, seeking privacy and normalcy. Few have defended their ancestors, adopting revisionist interpretations that minimize or excuse Nazi crimes. Rolf chose silence, but it was a knowing silence, one that came after he had looked into his father's eyes and seen the absence of remorse. He did not defend Josef. He did not celebrate his memory, but he also did not denounce him publicly until circumstances forced the family's hand. The moral calculus of that choice remains ambiguous. Rolf was not responsible for his father's crimes, but his silence extended the manhunt and denied closure to survivors. Where does the obligation of a child end? The broader Mengele story also connects to debates about German memory and the long shadow of the Nazi era. For decades after the war, West German society engaged in what some historians call collective amnesia, a widespread reluctance to investigate Nazi crimes too aggressively or to challenge the narratives of those who claimed ignorance or minimal involvement. The Angehörigenprivileg was part of this culture, a legal expression of the belief that family bonds should not be broken even by the worst crimes. As German society has grappled more directly with its Nazi past in recent decades, these assumptions have come under increased scrutiny. The town of Günzburg itself has struggled with the Mengele legacy. For decades, the family's prominence meant that the name was associated with employment and prosperity rather than atrocity. Workers who owed their livelihoods to Mengele Agrartechnik were not eager to investigate their employer's complicity in protecting a war criminal. Local officials faced pressure to downplay the connection rather than confront it. Only in recent years has Günzburg begun to address this history more directly, with memorials and educational initiatives that acknowledge Josef Mengele's crimes and the family's role in shielding him. The question of how to remember perpetrators and their families has no easy answers. Josef. Mengele's crimes are documented beyond any reasonable doubt. Survivor testimonies, Nazi records, and post-war investigations establish a clear picture of his activities at Auschwitz. He selected prisoners for the gas chambers. He conducted experiments that caused immense suffering. He showed enthusiasm for his work that horrified even some of his Nazi colleagues. These facts are not in dispute. What remains contested is how to understand the family that protected him. Were they motivated by love, by loyalty, by pragmatism, by ideology? The answer is probably some combination of all four, varying among family members and over time. The Mengeles were not fanatical Nazis in the mold of the true believers. They were business people, practical and calculating. They protected Josef not because they shared his enthusiasm for racial science, but because he was family. And family meant something that transcended individual crimes. This does not excuse their actions, but it may help explain them. The Mengele case stands as a cautionary tale about the limits of justice and the power of ordinary institutions to shield extraordinary evil. Josef Mengele was not protected by a vast conspiracy of ideological sympathizers. He was protected by a family business, by employee loyalty, by legal provisions designed for far more mundane situations. The machinery of his escape was not exotic. It was banal, the same combination of money, connections, and silence that protects far less notorious criminals every day. For survivors of Auschwitz and their descendants, the Mengele case represents a wound that never properly healed. The man who personified the horrors of the camp, who stood on the platform making life and death decisions with a gesture, who experimented on children with apparent scientific detachment, was never brought to justice. He lived into old age, complained about his circumstances, and died by accident rather than judgment. His family preserved his comfort and his anonymity, and then preserved his secret even after death. The survivors deserve better, history deserved better. Josef Mengele's name did not disappear through justice, it faded through time. The family that protected a monster paid no legal price. And the machinery of family loyalty, money, silence, and legal loopholes proved stronger than any manhunt. Some stories do not have satisfying endings. Some monsters escape. The Mengele case reminds us that justice is not automatic, that accountability requires constant vigilance, and that the bonds of family can be used to shield the worst as well as the best of humanity. The Mengele family's story mirrors Germany's own post-war trajectory in uncomfortable ways. Both the family and the nation faced a choice after 1945: confront the past honestly or construct narratives that minimized complicity and allowed life to continue. The family chose protection and silence. Much of German society made similar choices, at least initially. The or decades since have seen a gradual reckoning, an acknowledgement that the Nazi era cannot be sealed away as an aberration unconnected to ordinary German life. The Mengeles represent the road not taken, the path of permanent denial and successful evasion. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to Reinhard Heydrich's Family After WW2 next, where you'll discover how the widow of the Butcher of Prague spent 40 years defending her husband's legacy while running a guest house on a German island, and how their children navigated lives shadowed by one of the most feared names of the Third Reich. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more History Inside. Thanks for watching.